Gentlemen. Good people, you overwhelm me. Friends, we are to spend the next hour in one another's company, I with you, and you, most unfortunately, with me. And if this is the greeting we are to begin upon, this the footing by which this contract of conversation will begin, none of us will have any fun. So upon that, allow me to conjure some greater degree of exuberance from you. Ensure we begin upon the best footing. Once more I say, good afternoon. Indeed. Kairete, the Greek, salve, the Latin, shalom, the Hebrew, which rounds us back to hello. Ladies and gentlemen, I am privileged upon this occasion to step away from the various tribulations of the federal city and the offices of the chief magistrate to step to this most pastoral and reflective session to address you, the good people of this place called Chautauqua. Americans, friends, citizens. And before I do begin, I feel myself somewhat compelled by duty and honor, as my name and reputation has been consistently besmirched by Federalist newspapers, to offer introduction. For myself individually, I've had the privilege to walk with this nation every step since its inception, beginning in the year of our revolution, 1776, and carrying me through the majority of events that now constitute epochs of this nation's destiny. I have sat as legislator, congressman, author, secretary of state, and for these last several years have held the privilege of serving in the office of the presidency. My name, ladies and gentlemen, is James Madison, at your service. Stop. Steady in the back, steady. Now to that, as to the reasoning why we find ourselves herein assembled. 40 years ago, we, the people of America, from the taverns of New England, tobacco fields of Virginia, shores of Lake Chautauqua, embarked upon a singular experiment. An experiment that philosophy has waited for, an experiment that humanity has sighed for from the most remote ages of our common experience. 200 years ago, we resolved unanimously for an independency from Great Britain, from that rearing a new system. A system not derived from the usurped power of kings, of crowns, of potentates, of power, but rather instead the legitimate power of the people. You can clap for that if you wish. Yes. Now, with this independency, we had the opportunity to choose for ourselves whatever system of government was most conducive to our life, to our liberty, to the pursuance of our happiness, the inalienable rights that come from nature and nature's God. And with this opportunity, we chose the most volatile, the most detrimental, and the most turbulent system of government imaginable. We chose a republic, and not a republic that utilizes aristocracy, not a republic that utilizes the supremacy of one's blood, but rather instead a republic that utilizes the electric power of democracy. Now, throughout the annals of time, if you examine it, ladies and gentlemen, democratic experiments of government fail. They are short in their lives. They are volatile in their deaths. They are corruptible, just as man is corruptible. And I have often written that if every citizen of Athens were a Socrates, it still would have ended as a mob. And yet for these last 40 years, through 2 wars, we have endeavored to prove history wrong. Now, my beloved friends, I will not masquerade to you. The situation of America, and indeed throughout the world, is without parallel, is it not? Come, is it not? We see every day our federal constitution stretched and questioned in its validity, do we not? We see every day America endeavor to establish itself upon an international stage, do we not? We see the venomous bite of political party and the pervading bite of jealousy between the two, do we not? And we see every day the corrupt and fallible nature of our Congress. So then, Why should I deviate from the business of Washington, step away from the social affability of my wife to address you in this most scenic of settings? Well, it should be, friends, for this briefest period of time to rekindle the spirit of patriotism which has waned so consistently over the course of these many years. To rekindle the bravery which first embarked us upon this wilderness without a single footstep to guide us, to rekindle the unity that ought always belong to the name of American, to go back to our beginnings, and from that, understand the road before us. I began my political career in 1776 as a young man of 25. There in the old colonial capital of Williamsburg, Virginia. Uncomfortable in my skin, I took part in the drafting of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, the Constitution of that self-same year. Initiated myself into a political career that has carried me to this point. And I say that because a particular article of that Declaration of Rights comes to mind. And that is, no free government can long endure without virtue, without frugality, and without a frequent recurrence to fundamental principles. To understand our government, we must reflect. It could be argued that our Constitution is the careful work of reflection. And indeed, ladies and gentlemen, I can reflect and wax eloquently upon the events of our revolution, the battles that won us of our independence, the victories at Saratoga, stalemates at Monmouth, the world being turned upside down at Yorktown, Virginia. And yet, is that the revolution? The revolution that so much blood was spilt for? Can it be distilled and simplified solely to the events where cannon and cutlass decided the fate? Or is the true American Revolution one of pen, one of ink? That is the revolution into which I have fought in over the course of my life. Make no mistake, ladies and gentlemen, I had no role in the war for independence. I have never a day been a soldier. The most violent thing I've ever done is sneeze. And yet, after our independency was won, it could be argued that our true revolution began. Oh, indeed, the United States of America was born upon the second day of July, 1776. Our Declaration voted upon and signed upon the 4th of July, 1776. And yet the United States, over the course of its first formative years of existence, was growing uncomfortably in itself. Like a teenager, it was anxious for something greater, yet clumsy in its own skin. When we spoke of the United States, we spoke of the United States as a multiplicity of nations. Each state having its own system of government, having its own constitution, having its own enumeration of rights, having its own general spirit. Now, the great philosopher Montesquieu, who I will speak upon several times over the course of our conversation, says that every nation is possessed of a general spirit, a spirit that outside of party, outside of faction, outside of commerce, binds it and defines it together. Well, from there, in the early days of our republic, every state was affixed with its own spirit, a spirit that contradicted the spirit of its fellow states. This led to a continent that was embroiled in faction, a party embroiled with petty jealousies, a pervading bite, and ultimately a distrust of our fellow states. Place a Virginian and a New Yorker in the room, and inevitably it should descend into argument. Now, moreover, our system of government that we were operating under, the Articles of Confederation, were proving wholly deficient. Drafted in... Mr. Anthony, I do believe that is one of your native birds that I heard calling from my room early this morning. That sounded like a male. And I do believe it was its mating call. The gentleman from New York affirms. the system of government we were operating under, the Articles of Confederation, were drafted in York, Pennsylvania in 1777. Now, this charter could be said was a constitution of the United States, but it was a loose agreement between these 13 separate and distinct nations. It was bound for two purposes: to unite the Union for security and for goodwill. Well, in 1783, with the Treaty of Paris, we had no further need to be united by security, and so it was goodwill and goodwill alone that united us together. So, of course, it should have lasted forever, yes? What, do you doubt that goodwill is enough to unite mankind together? No, I agree with you. I have often written that if men were angels, no system of government would be necessary. And what is government if not the purest reflection of human nature? And so what did we see over the course of those formative years? We saw the corrupt nature of our Congress. We saw consistently nations endeavoring to intermeddle in our affairs and cultivate loyalties that contradicted between the states. We saw divisions north and south, and we saw a national deficit that was climbing to a cataclysmic tens of millions of dollars. I know. Pick up your jaws. Now, moreover, when I spoke of that general spirit, there was a far more pervading problem. And that was, there were citizens across the continent of North America who sat with expectation that this union would fail, that it would join the piles of misguided confederations and prove ultimately that people need kings, that man is incapable of governing themselves. Now, why did they think this way? Because at that present moment, the writings upon Republican systems of government were small. You had, of course, Plato's Republic, where he defined virtue as a necessary step. You had, of course, the writings of Montesquieu, who said republics needed be small. They could not exist upon an extended continental scale. And moreover, it needed a people who all thought the same way. And so there was great distrust that as a continent, the whole of North America could long endure as one empire. But that rather instead we should break away, be left to our own devices, left independent and sovereign states amongst ourselves. And so the words spread across the tables and firesides of North America was disunion, was separation, was inevitably civil war. Now, I will say, ladies and gentlemen, I have never been one to consign myself to the opinions of the majority. And as so much blood had been spilt over the course of our revolution, I began a small project. In the 1780s, I enlisted the help of a dear friend of mine by the name of Thomas Jefferson. Perhaps you have heard of him. If you have not, he most assuredly will see to it that you do. Now, my worthy friend, Mr. Jefferson, was minister plenipotentiary to France, bestowed with all the powers to represent the United States of America abroad. And from there, Mr. Jefferson and I brokered an agreement. I would see to the education and care of several young gentlemen in whose education he was invested, and in turn, he would send me books. I got the finer end of that bargain, I think. And so over the course of the 1780s, during the recesses of government, I retired to my family's estate. We have some 5,000 acres in Orange County, Virginia, where both paternal and maternal, we have cultivated the soil. And from there, in the spring of 1785, the first crate of books arrived. A Diderot's Encyclopedia. Well, from there, I thought our bargain completed. And yet the following week, another crate of books arrived. I complimented my friend's generosity. And yet the following week, another crate. The following week, another crate. Very quickly, the books and volumes began to stack. My library became a forest bed of sawdust and, well, from there, a litany of books. Indeed, when connections came to call upon me and I did not wish to see them, I made habit of disappearing between the stacks. Over the course of the year, I read several hundred volumes of political theorem. All confined within my father's study, I began a regiment where at the beginnings of the day I would take some small breakfast and read until the sun set on the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. You see through the vast theater of the world certain scenes which move with endless repetition. The same faults follow the same misfortunes. We had resolved for an independency in 1776, but mankind cannot change his nature. So from there, I began to read of the confederations of Amphictyon, of Achaean, of every system of government who had tried a government like ours and failed, not to learn from their victories, but more importantly, to learn from their misfortunes. And through the course of that, I arrived at a singular conclusion. No government will be perfect. And yet, if a government cannot be perfect, perchance, just perchance, it can become more perfect. Now, through the course of that, we needed a convention to amend the Articles of Confederation. We would call a convention in 1786 in Annapolis, Maryland, and it would fail because, let's be honest, it's Annapolis, Maryland. It was not centrally located enough, not convenient enough for a great many of the delegates. And so from that convention, we schemed again that in a year's time in the spring in Philadelphia City, another convention would be called to amend the Articles of Confederation. 55 delegates were appointed from 12 state legislatures, Rhode Island withholding, sending delegates, ever jealous of its sovereignty. And in the spring of 1787, 55 gentlemen arrived at the various taverns and boarding houses of Philadelphia with the expectation that at the end of May, they would be part of a body to fix the Articles of Confederation. 54 of those gentlemen were horribly mistaken, because one of those 55 had his own plan of government. And moreover, he held a secret weapon to ensure that all gentlemen at that convention would behave. Now, though he is some time deceased, there is one individual who can unite the whole of a continent of North America together, who can compel armies to greatness and a people to virtue. An individual whom, without not only the Constitution, but equally the office of the presidency, would not exist. You know this gentleman. His Excellency, General Washington. I had for some time been a collaborator, and though strange as he is somewhat my senior, a mentor upon matters politic to George Washington. In fact, when he was appointed president, he gave me the honor of anonymously writing his inaugural address. Congress, being unaware that he did that, asked me to anonymously write the response to it. The president, being unaware of that, asked me to write the response to that. This continued, the author complimenting the eloquence of the other writer. Yes. My wife often says the beginnings of our federal government were just James Madison mumbling to himself. And yet, at that present moment in 1787, Washington did not wish to attend the convention. He had denied the invitation of another assembly in Philadelphia and did not wish to appear rude by agreeing to another convention taking place at the same time. Now, after some spurning, he agreed to come, so long as it was not announced widely that he was in attendance. Well, when he arrived in Philadelphia, every church bell rang. And I wrote in my diary, Washington has come. And in the 22nd of May, we would convene, not every state together all at once, but rather in small bodies, making preparations and plans. And finally, on the 29th day of May, the plan that I had so carefully worked upon, the plan that had taken several years of research, the plan that was compiled from every popular system of government, was introduced. It was introduced by Mr. Edmund Randolph, not by myself. I am notoriously bad at speaking publicly. And from there, through the course of the summer of 1787, we argued like so many politicians have done from the beginnings of history. The windows were nailed shut as the stifling heat of summer grew, and we asked questions. What role will slavery play in this extended republic? How can a continent so wide geographically succeed in a republican form? What shall stop these states from bickering amongst themselves? How can you regulate commerce? What will stop your chief magistrate from becoming king? And how shall you craft a population or one representative to represent 32,000 people? It was thought impossible. It was thought more than that, improbable. And it was highly thought inefficient. Now, through the course of the whole of the convention, I missed not a single day. I sat at the front of the assembly hall and took rigorous notes. I have a shorthand of the 7 languages that I speak. I use whatever the shortest word is in that language. Now, I did this for a singular reason. We often see, ladies and gentlemen, where governments die. With blood, with poverty, with corruption. Rarely do we see where they are born. With the truest of intents and purest of intentions. With our Constitution, this Constitution which has endured now for the better part of a generation, we have in perpetuity its beginnings. To see the arguments held in place from the individuals so different, so divided upon party lines, and yet inevitably coming together in compromise. Now, at the end of the summer of 1787, bleeding into September, the debate came forward as to what role a Bill of Rights would hold within the Constitution. A gentleman from Virginia by the name of George Mason, who had authored the Virginia Declaration of Rights, said, "Gentlemen, I would rather chop off my right arm than adopt this Constitution without a Bill of Rights. It'll give great ease to the people. It can be done in an afternoon." Colonel Mason should know that men of government cannot sign their names in an afternoon. Now, moreover, we had labored for the better part of the summer and made hard-won compromises. To suddenly put forward what liberties and rights every American citizen should be enumerated would likely cause a great dissolution of the convention. What should stop from the South from making it an essential piece to enumerate the right to own individuals in perpetuity as a right promised to all Americans? Moreover, what of the unlimited rights that should be left out? And so his motion was defeated. Our Constitution would have no Bill of Rights. And yet still there would be various provisions to protect the American people: the forbidding of bills of attainder, the promise of habeas corpus, and various other provisions as to what rights would be promised to the state governments. And on the 17th day of December, as we were preparing to take a vote, Dr. Benjamin Franklin, the most senior member of that body, well known for his virtues and his vices, stood up to address the body. He was so infirm in speaking that James Wilson, a fellow delegate, addressed the people on Franklin's behalf. He said that this system of government was not perfect, but that to his mind, he had never seen a system of government so little imperfect. He gestured to the chair that President Washington occupied. There upon its back, a half-sun sat carved in relief. He said over the course of the deliberations, he had wondered whether this sun was rising or setting. He said upon observing the Constitution, it was indeed a rising sun. He said all governments end in despotism. They end as such when a people become so unruly, despotism is the sole form of government that can rule over them. And when we stepped out of Freedom Hall, the same hall that produced our Declaration of Independence, the people of Philadelphia gathered. They had been in the dark the whole of the summer, the deliberations kept secret. They rushed. Dr. Franklin said, "What have you given us? A monarchy, a republic, what?" Dr. Franklin said, "We have given you a republic, if you can keep it." That has been the labor of every American citizen since the drafting of our Constitution. to keep our republic. And of course, once the Constitution was drafted, a second battle began, a battle to ratify the document, every state holding ratification conventions. From there came the true labor of convincing the people of your native province that the Constitution was a worthy undertaking. The Constitution was not popular in New York. Gentlemen like Clinton, Livingston, and DeWitt had long held a jealousy of their sovereignty and did not wish to cede it to the South. And so I was approached, a member of Congress and residing in New York, by a gentleman and former friend named Alexander Hamilton. And from there, he asked me, with the assistance of writing a series of essays in defense of that Constitution. And over the course of a year, he wrote some 51, Mr. J wrote some 10, and I wrote some 29, my 29 far superior. Now, the labor of this was excessive. We wrote some 4,000 words a day, oftentimes sitting at the printer, and while he arranged the sorts and type for one page, we were writing the next. And so the labor of these Federalist papers would often find themselves contradictory, and yet what was discovered with these papers is the true argument for what is in our Constitution, why it is there, and why it must be treasured, of why a people must keep it. It has been a great many years and a great many steps since that Constitution was drafted. We have seen over the course of time a series of 12 amendments, proof that our Constitution can change with a people. We have seen the rise of artificial faction of political parties which every day divide a nation, and yet America and its principles endure. We have seen a second war with England, a war which has touched these shores, which has burned our capital to the ground, and yet America endures. There it is again, Mr. Anthony. I believe it is the female that time, answering the male's call. Now, over the course of all of that, what advice should I, a young man who espoused in his youth the ideas of a well-regulated Republican system of government, bestow upon a people who find themselves searching for the principles of their government? It should be to hearken not to the unnatural voice which tells you that the people of America, knit together as they are by so many cords of affection, cannot be members of the same family, cannot be the mutual guardians of their mutual happiness, cannot be children of one flourishing empire. Hearken not to the voice which says this system is a novelty in the political world, that it has no place in the wildest of projectors, the rashest of intents. No. Shut your ears to that unhallowed language. Shut your hearts to the poison it conveys. And if novelties are to be shunned, the wildest of projectors is that we are better divided than we are united. I sit and marvel at this present moment as we move to the turn of the 19th century. When we look across the Atlantic to revolutionary France, who has adopted a republican mode of government similar to ours, that in their short life they have had 9 constitutions. And yet America still has its first. The happy union of these states is a wonder. Its constitution, a miracle. Its example, the hope of freedom and liberty throughout the world. And what role do you then, the citizenry of this experiment of government, have? It is to be enlightened, to be awakened, to be united. And when you find yourself searching for the step forward, to have the courage to look behind at where we have been. And to speak of the future in full form, ladies and gentlemen, and to speak indeed as friends, friendship delighting in plainness and simplicity, I should wish to continue this conversation with a small confession to you. It may shock you, it may stupefy you, it may entirely flabbergast you and lead you running from this room. I am not, in fact, James Madison. You can get your refunds at the door. My name is Bryan Austin. I'm a constitutional scholar and James Madison scholar. And I want to thank you so much for expanding your imaginations to have a conversation with Mr. Madison today. Now, with the time we have left, I'm going to talk a little bit about Madison's legacy, about who he was in the American political spectrum, as well as to answer some questions that you have. Now, Madison is often overlooked in the pantheon of American founders. We can spout a few details. His wife really had a thing for ice cream. We know something about the Federalist Papers, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution. We know he was the 4th president of the United States, and he was a pretty short guy. But as far as Madison's lasting impact in the American political spectrum today, he is everywhere. It could be said he's the first career politician. And moreover, a great many of the precedents we still find today and Madison's invention of American federalism is still going strong today, despite every attempt to rend it apart. Now, from that, Madison was a bookworm. He spent his whole life in study, and from that study, applying it to how a political experiment like America can work. Now, he was a product of the Scotch Enlightenment. The age in which Madison lived in was a fascinating time. They were leaving the medieval world behind and instead embracing for the first time ideas of liberty, of private property, of life as a fundamental right. From there, deviating into civic rights, civic responsibility, civic privilege. And from there, they lived in an age that so few had had before, where the diffusion of the written word was readily available to them. They could sit within their studies and they could travel the wide swath of history and for the first time understand how that can apply to them. So it could be said the American Revolution began with economy, the dreaded Stamp Act and the taxes that were put forward. But for a great many, it began with an idea. See, ideas are perfect. Ideas are uncorruptible. Man's far from perfect. Man is very corruptible. And in the age that Madison was born in, man was venerated. Thomas Hobbes writes in Of Commonwealth, the greatest danger to kings is young men reading books, because it makes them fall in love with ideas and not with men. And so when Thomas Jefferson put quill to paper and put forward saying we hold these truths to be self-evident, he was putting forward the notion that the American political system of government would stand for ideas. Because ideas can change with the time, so long as those fundamental truths remain self-evident. Now, James Madison, of course, got swept up in that same business of revolution. He became best buddies with Thomas Jefferson. It said no two brothers are as close as Jefferson and Madison. Jefferson tries and tries to get Madison to move and be neighbors with him. Madison, time and time again, says, I have too much homework, Tom, I can't. Because in the 80s, Madison rose as this political dynamo, taking all the knowledge that he had and endeavoring to apply it to a political system of government. Now, Madison can't be stated and attributed to have invented checks and balances. The notion of separation of powers heavily comes from Montesquieu. But what Madison can be credited for is how he utilizes separation of powers, not only in the branches of government, but also on a federal and state scale, also on a factional scale. Madison believed that an extended republic could work because people are naturally diverse. The greatest danger in popular systems of government isn't the tyranny from the government. It's a majority rising up and creating an interest contrary to a minority, because no Bill of Rights, no Declaration of Rights is going to protect that minority. That was the case for Baptists in Virginia. That was the case for Catholics in Virginia. That was the case equally for the thousands of people of color in the condition of slavery. Madison understood faction as an inevitability in a popular system of government. So rather than sitting and saying, okay, republics have to be small and everyone has to think the same, Madison gets this idea and says, no. Rather, instead, let's push the boundary. Let's make it so big that there are so many people of so many different beliefs that if they're going to be a majority, they've got to be united on something big. They've got to be united on a big idea. And that's exactly what happened. Now, America's gone through a great many difficult things. The Constitution, it could be argued, was established to try to prevent a civil war. And by the end of Madison's life in 1836, he saw the writing on the wall. The last thing he had published, which was to be published after he died, was Advice to My Country, which said, the advice deepest in my heart, deepest in my convictions, is that the union of the states be cherished and perpetuated. The secret one, the serpent creeping with its deadly wills into paradise. He watched as slavery was being expanded after the Missouri decision. He watched as North and South became even more consistently divided. And after Madison's death, the fate of slavery would forever be decided with the spilling of blood. The Constitution endures. This is a miracle. Considering how many constitutions after America and before have undergone contradiction, have undergone change, have undergone turmoil, and with them the government itself collapsing and some other tyrannical regime replacing it. And yet America, despite all attempts from people with agenda, from tyrants, from political parties, has still endured with that same Constitution. And that's because of Madison's notion of balance. He understands that you can't stop a government from growing in power. Power is necessary and power corrupts. This is an unfortunate thing. And so you put forward balance in all political ideas to ensure that whatever way you endeavor to move it, to twist it, it continues on that same even path. He fights for that balance over the course of his whole political career. It's why some historians accuse Madison of sort of flip-flopping. But it's because he endeavors, anytime he sees the ship getting corrected one way, to try and move the other, to balance it out. He fought the National Bank in the 1790s, and as president, recharters it a second time because it understands how the political waves move. We see Madison's legacy in so many of our political scriptures. And even today, when we find ourselves still divided, still affixed with all the various problems we face today, we can sit with confidence that our Constitution can endure, can stay balanced. And so what role can we have in honoring Madison's legacy? We can take a page out of his book, study our history, study what came before. Madison left us an amazing inheritance because those notes he took during the Constitutional Convention, they can be found on Amazon, they can be found online, they can be found on every bookshelf, which is my secret hope. And so when we have questions about what should be or what shouldn't be, whether we should put forward term limits for our Congress, whether the Electoral College is outdated, Madison left us a map. We can study those things. Madison says some of the greatest dangers in government is changing things out of novelty. Because something's not working right now, it should be changed. Yet the problem we're sitting under is so much government. There's an argument that goes around that our government's too big, right? Yeah? It's because we think big. But there are so many layers of government that sit between us and the federal. Begins at home. I faced more tyranny from my HOA than I ever do the federal government. We have our state government. We have our federal government. We sit under so many strata, and those stratas are federalism. And so understanding every facet of government, what your role is in it, getting to know your local representatives by name are all ways in which you can honor the legacy of the founding fathers. Someone once wrote that democracy is a contact sport, and it very much is, because it extends so much beyond your voting booth and what ballot you decide on. It begins with the ability to accommodate the differences of your fellow men, but to be united on the big ideas that make us Americans. And in coming here today, talking about this history, talking about our political ideas, you're doing one of the greatest things an American citizen can do. Thinking.
Talking from Virginia, the prevalent of New York State, and stuff are Q&A microphones. So I'm going to ask you to give a question instead of coming up here. Just stand where you are. You're going to have this works, Paul. It's working.
Oh, it's working.
It's working.
Great.
Mr. Madison, as people queue up, I would welcome you to Chautauqua. I would
Thank
ask
you.
to notice that we are very gray. We are all white.
Me too. The gray part and the
We
white.
are very privileged and very privileged to have you.
It's okay.
And I came to this meeting in reference to your role in adopting the Bill of Rights, and I'm so pleased to learn more about your role in the constitutional process. I would ask you about the Bill of Rights. Was it enacted in order to guarantee and preserve privilege? Or was it enacted to create a roadmap so that any wretched person cast upon our shores could participate in American democracy?
That's a very good question. So upon that, do you want Madison or his friend?
Madison.
Very good.
Madison.
Very good. So first and foremost, when we understand the ideas of liberty, we must first and foremost study what the genesis of liberty is, to wit, the rights of human nature, of which there are three. Rights that are natural, coming from nature, and therefore not to be infringed upon. Those are the rights of life, liberty, and of course, what else? No, don't get ahead of yourself. Property. Life, the blood in your veins, the humors that constitute who you are, liberty, your unshackled mind, and last of all, property, which is thought to be the sole basis of government and happiness, if we look to the classical sense of felicity. Now, property also has a secondary meaning. When you look to property, you have the Latin word proprius as its root. That means that which pertains to yourself. So not only your tangible property, but the intangible property. Property to your ideas, the property to yourself, the property to pursue your own ends and to pursue your own happiness. Now, this is nature without any system of government. The only law that exists in nature is you cannot encroach on the rights of your fellow creatures. Everyone must get along always, no matter what. We have all evidence to prove that will not work. Cain will always slay Abel. Samson will always tear the columns down. Pharaoh will always become tyrant over the people of Israel. So all government is, be it from the Athenian contracts of Theseus, the codes of Solon, of Hammurabi, of Justinian, is the notion that we will all live somewhat restricted so that we all might live freer. That is all government is. And so to do this, we constitute civic rights, rights that are made by man to protect the natural rights that come from nature. So for this, man's right to life, is this a natural right or a civic right? Natural. Man's right to liberty, natural or civic? Man's right to property, natural or civic? Man's right to a trial by jury, natural or civic? Man's right to keep and bear arms, natural or civic? Man's right to religion, natural or civic? This is where we get complicated. Religion. Is it a civic right to be regulated by man, or is it your greatest property? What is your opinion, your faith, if not your greatest property? Now, there has been great controversy over that course of time prior to the Bill of Rights in what role religion should play in government. There have been a great many who say religion is the sole metric by which virtue can be mandated. And if that is the case, why so often do we see so much immorality in the political scriptures that have been put forward? Why has the blood in Europe been so soaked within the ground because of religious wars? Now, in 1776, the Virginia Declaration of Rights promised for the first time that all should have the free exercise of religion. And yet still, over the course of the next 10 years, Baptists were still disturbed, still placed in jail. It was still illegal for a Catholic to practice in Virginia. And to be eligible to vote, you still needed to be Protestant. But there's a declaration saying all should have the freedom for religion. This is where I arrived at the conclusion that these declaration of rights are parchment barriers. If man wishes to encroach on the rights of their fellow man, they still will. And yet, the lack of a Bill of Rights would become the shibboleth by which anti-federalists would unite.
Okay.
And so it became a promise upon my behalf that should the Constitution be ratified, I should labor to put forward a Bill of Rights. Now, who do these rights belong to? Well, if we're to accept that they are derived from the rights of human nature, then these rights should apply to the whole of human nature. And from there, what qualities should be belonging to an American citizen? When daily we see those migrate upon our shores, endeavoring to aspire to the higher ideas. If we are a people united by ideas, then inevitably any who wishes to ought hold the title of citizen. And so I sat down as a member of Congress after a hard-won political victory to become a representative of the 6th District to set forward for the drafting of a Bill of Rights. There were initially 12. The 10 amendments of our Constitution, protecting in the First Amendment those natural liberties, equally the freedom for opinion and our right therein to assemble, speak freely, petition our government, and therein moving into the civic rights after the various injuries we saw in our former system of government, ensuring soldiers will never be quartered within homes, ensuring one will never incriminate themselves, protecting us from unwarranted search in Caesars like the various writs of assistance we saw during our time as British subject. And yet I will say the most important of these amendments are Amendments 9 and Amendments 10. Does anyone know what the 9th Amendment says? It's all right, I do. I wrote it. That all rights not enumerated are equally protected. Because as the American people, shall we be a people of 10 rights? Or the unlimited rights of human nature to be decided now, decided by our ancestors and decided by our posterity? It should always be the pride and boast of America that the rights for which we contend with are the rights of human nature. And the work that is not done today will need be done by tomorrow. Yes.
Yeah. Mr. President, did the founders anticipate the growth of the 4th department of government that now swirls around us, called the media? That the media is now the influencer of the thinking of the people.
Yes. Shall I clarify more? We might remember the John Adams administration. We might remember his Alien and Sedition Acts, whereby anything printed in criticism of the government was met as sedition, where Americans, after expressing their opinion, were imprisoned. A monster that forever disgraced its parents. Now, from there, how can we have a free press when inevitably there will be those who endeavor to cultivate the swaying of mankind towards one political estimation? And ought that liberty be removed because a people are deceived or swayed? This is where responsibility comes in the business of government, where it is essential. So populus dissipi dissipiatur. If the people wish to be deceived, they'll be deceived. Now, from there, it is not the responsibility of a government to censor the press, but rather instead the responsibility of a citizenry to be enlightened. The most powerful thing in a popular system of government is opinion. And whether that opinion is based upon something valid or something false matters not. So from there, the agency by which the American citizenry operates, their opinion is the greatest weapon they have in government. I will say the press has not been kind to me over the course of my administration, labeling this war currently as Mr. Madison's war, referring to me as Little Jimmy. I will not direct you to the most recent political cartoons that depict me, but it is not favorable. Now, as to calling it a 4th branch of the federal government, I would not go so far as to label it as such. Our Constitution enumerates in Articles 1 through 3 the various branches of our government, yet the power by which it might hold is vested solely in how much power a people are willing to give it. And from there comes the responsibility to look towards every avenue of truth, to study who are the true friends of a union. I will direct you to the 17 and 90s. I don't know what bird that is, Mr. Anthony. In the 17 and 90s, we began to see a faction form in the federal government that were providing bounties to favorites, that were forgetting their responsibilities to the American people. Newspapers were established in defense of the various measures being taken. And President Washington, though he endeavored to remain above it, was equally getting pulled in. And so I turned to a friend of mine from college by the name of Philip Freneau. And from there started the first rival American newspaper. Now, all of these actions would eventually spawn partisan newspapers, both the National Intelligencer and the National Gazette taking their own distinct perspectives. Now, the responsibility of the American citizen is to look towards truth, veritas, and truth so often is colored in by both perspectives. It is, as I said in the notions of the Constitution, balance. It is not the responsibility of the newspapers to be balanced. They have too many papers to sell. It is the responsibility of the American citizenry to find balance within it.
Seeing no more questions, you're supposed to be here. Come on over. So everyone can hear you. I will mention now while we're waiting that if you want to meet Bryan or James Madison, he'll be out on the front porch. Take some photographs if you wish, or just ask him about some other things. Ask him about Dolly. Woo.
I don't believe we have enough time left for that.
We have had in our time a preponderance of imposition of present day sensibilities on the people and activities of the past. What would you have to say as James Madison and as yourself concerning this?
Concerning people of the past?
People and activities of the past. For example, that even to the founding fathers, if they held slaves, there are those who would say erase their names, their statues.
I understand, sir. I understand. In 1776, in New York City, a statue that had arrived in 1774 of King George III to commemorate the victory of the French and Indian War was torn down, a monument torn down, and from there melted down into bullets to assail the brains of British officers. The same time in Williamsburg, Virginia, portraits of His Majesty King George III and his wife, Queen Charlotte, were placed upon a pyre and burned. And yet, a statue of our former royal governor, Lord Botetourt, was left untampered with. A portrait of William of Orange, who put forward the British Declaration of Rights, was untampered with. Why is that? Because inevitably, a people decide what they keep as a roadmap towards the future. Now, I should speak easily upon the contradictions of slavery. There are a great many gentlemen who endeavor to ask me to justify it, and I do not. We see in this enlightened age the mere distinction of color, justification for the most oppressive dominion of mankind. I myself hold some 130 individuals in bondage. Names of Katie, Suki, Anthony, Troilus, all prescribed upon the tax records of my family's estate. I am no better than any other slaveholder. But I turn back to that same notion that America does not venerate. Moreover, if we do, what does that teach the living? What we ought teach is that those who reared this system of government were not angels bound and destined with any divine inspiration, but a people who argued, who compromised, who fought, and who sacrificed. A people just like you today. Mankind is imperfect, and yet put forward something far more perfect than any one individual can be. So when we speak of history and teach it, we cannot venerate it, but rather instead learn from both its faults and its fortunes. After all, if our American Constitution was born out of understanding where the past failed, what new innovations can America put forward by understanding the missteps of the past? And yet in not telling any of that, in washing away the various histories put forward, you lose all possibility not only to learn from the mistakes, but to find comfort in the victories. Studying history is the most essential thing a people can do, and therefore all history must be told.
One more question.
Hello. I'm not sure if my question is for President Madison or his friend.
I can go get him.
Okay, it'll be your choice. Would one of you address the filibuster? Thank you. The filibuster. Thank you.
Address what?
The filibuster.
The filibuster. Oh, thank you. I thought you said the Philippines, and I said, I can't help you with that. The filibuster. The term was not coined in Madison's time specifically. Madison was an innovator of things like the pocket veto and things of that nature. But as the notion of sort of holding the Senate floor hostage specifically, that wasn't necessarily in Madison's time. We have to understand the Senate has evolved quite a bit from Madison's time. The 17th Amendment changed the nature of what the Senate is. The Senate was meant to be the smaller branch of government, the more deliberate branch of government, the wiser branch of government. It's why when treaties come up, the president, the executive branch, works in tandem with the Senate. It's why the vice president of the United States is president of the Senate. Now, who elected the senators at the beginning? The states. So you also had a relationship between state and federal government. Now, it could be argued in adding that more democratic method of electing senators, do we lose something? As a constitutional scholar, I'll argue yes. I think so. I think it's made two branches who behave the exact same way, inevitably turning to the people for re-election. The House of Representatives is designed to be the more partisan branch of government. It's designed to be a branch calling out more for novelty, catering to the more pathos-driven side of us, the one that makes us act out of emotion or of fears. The Senate was designed specifically to be the more deliberate branch. I think in our modern times, something that we are losing is a Senate that is behaving exactly the same way as the House. Now, Madison still was a politician in many regards. He understood the value of holding the floor, and it could be argued the first filibuster that ever happened was at the Constitutional Convention. So the Virginia Plan gets put forward, and they're debating. And over the course of late May, early June of 1787, a rival political plan comes up, the New Jersey Plan. And they're debating hotly, and they're not getting anywhere. And so finally, at the end of June, Alexander Hamilton steps up, and he talks about his idea of a perfect government. He says, let's have a president that's inherited from father to son. Let's do away with the states. Let's have an economic system that's the same as England. With the windows nailed shut, in the heat of summer, he talks for 6 hours. The following day, the Virginia Plan gets adopted. So that's not to say that there wasn't filibustering happen. The term just wasn't coined yet. But it does go to show you that not much has changed, and that's not a bad thing. As long as we study those things, we can do great changes in our time. So from there, I'm so very glad to have spent time with you. I will be available for pictures and such.